All right, hello everybody, and welcome back. This is part two of my calculator application series, where I've gone over in the previous video in part one the HTML and CSS, so basically the structure and styling of the calculator. And in part two, I'm going to go over the JavaScript, which is essentially the logic. Like, how did I get, when I click the button 8 plus 8, how did I get an equal? How did I get that equivalent to 16? How did I get that display? How did I get that all to calculate? So that's essentially what I'm going to be showing over here, how I program that to happen, and also how I got the button to clear. All right, so looking on the left side of my screen, this is where I started off with kind of programming the logic behind the basic operators of a calculator, so addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication. And up here in the top left is where I created those that functionality and a little, I created this functionality through functions. In the top left, I have the add function highlighted, and that's what's kind of tied into this plus operator right here, this plus button down here, and basically just to kind of break it apart and kind of explain it to you guys. Right here is what I have it's called a function declaration. We have this function keyword, then I have the name of the function, which is add, and then right here I have the parameters, and I'll get into why this parameter is particularly interesting later. But then also in here I have the body of my function, which is essentially whatever is happening based on the input in the parameters, and it's returning a certain output based on those inputs. So essentially, whenever I call this function with whatever parameters, that parameter is going to be passed through this, I say process or procedure that is the body of the function, and then it's going to return that output in the form of a result, which is actually somewhere down here. If I could find it, it's a what you would call it? It's a variable that I've declared somewhere down here. Or did I declare it in? Yeah, sorry, declared it right here. It's declared it within the function. So, without further ado, just give it a little more further instruction. So, again, I talked about the why this parameter is interesting. This parameter is interesting because of these ellipses right here, and then this name of this parameter right here. So these ellipses right here is a spread operator, and this right here is the arguments. So basically, what this combination does is that whatever inputs, it basically gives me an indefinite amount of inputs that can go into this parameter. Usually if you hard code, like didn't have this spread operator and I just put, a regular variable name, it's really going to be, it would be only able to take one argument to pass into that parameter. So the reason why that's interesting and why I think it's cool is because I know I'm not able to tell what a user is going to type into here, or what specific buttons or numbers an operator is going to be able to type in here. But what's interesting is this argument, this args or the spread operator allows me to just type in an indefinite amount of parameters, and I'll get an output. All right. So, but basically the basic function of these operator functions is that, right, we have an indefinite amount of parameters. So we don't really know how many arguments are in here, but when these arguments are input, they get placed into an array, right? So, like, say if I entered in 5 and 6 into this function, once that function is being called with the 5 and 6 input, then we create an array within the function. We create an array variable, and then from that array, because this is actually not technical, it doesn't take it to an array. It makes it an array-like object. So what I want to do is create an array, create a variable, assign it, and create it to an array based on the arguments that are entered into the parameters. So basically, like if I type in 5 and 6, then in this line right here, I'm creating an array that's comprised of the 5 and 6 as elements. And then once I have that that variable in here with the 5 and 6 in the array, what I then do is create another variable, and based on that result, and another variable where I just take the array that was created from this line right here, and then I utilize the reduce method, which generates has parameters, which I'm going to it's basically just the two inputs, 5 and 6. This would be 5 and 6, and then calling a function on it to an arrow function to just essentially add those. So now that those two elements in an array, 5 and 6, are now going to be added to one another. So that's basically how you get the function out to, or basically utilize this function to get 5 plus 6, and then you return a result, and then the result is going to be 11. So that's how I'm able to do 5 plus 6 equals 11, right? And then it's essentially the same way for the rest of these functions. And all I simply did was just replace the operator. So, right, you can see the same. Here's the addition, here's the subtraction, here's the multiplication, and here's the division. So that kind of sums up the operator, or the basic functions for the operators over here. All right, so moving further down the file, I'm going to get in some of these variables that I declared. One thing I'd like to note is that these variables are globally scoped, meaning that all the different functions, or all of the different, basically anywhere in this file, these variables can be, accessed and manipulated, as in comparison to the global, or not global, but local or block scoped variables that are right here, like this array. I couldn't do anything outside of this function with that array variable because it's only scoped to this specific function. But this function could actually manipulate this first input variable if I so choose to, or if I thought it deemed it need to be necessary. As you can see, like right here, this first input is actually being utilized in this, or it's actually assigning a value to, or access to, this function that's actually lower into it, but I'll get into that later. But again, so this first input variable is a variable for the first input in, like for either for an operation, right? And then we have the operator variable that basically helps me assign and helps the program know what operator I'm trying to utilize based on whatever the user clicks. So it basically, if I press this plus button, now that operator function, or that operator variable, is going to be consistent of the plus sign. And basically that's utilized later in further functions. Getting a little bit ahead of myself, so I'm just going to go down, start talking about the second input. And basically the second input, like in a situation like 5 plus 5 plus 3 would be the second input. And then we have operation counter. Basically helps me, this is how I've chained, or helps me to chain operator events. So like if I wanted to do 5 plus 5 minus 3 equals 7, because I have this operation counter here, later again in further functions I can help explain like why that counter is there, just basically helping me being able to chain and know how many times operators have been chosen. All right, so reason why I wanted to mention that a lot of these variables are globally scoped is that because a lot of these operators are utilized in either some of the previous functions, like such as these basic operator arguments, or these basic operator functions, and then also they're utilized in subsequent functions, such as this operator one. And that's what next one I'm going to be talking about. Again, I declared this function. This function's basic overall structure is designed to take certain inputs, such as the first input, the second input, and the operator, and then from that sequence, or from those inputs, generate a final result. So I want to explain this function without getting too into the weeds with it, just because it is a little bit bloated. But just to give, like, this chunk right here is essentially just assigning all the first input and the second input parameters and the operator parameters that are needed to operate on a functions, right? You're going to need the first input, which would be the first number that you type into the display before you execute a operator, and then the second input would be the second input that you place after you did the first input and the operator. And then once you press equals, then it begins to operate and utilize this function. So again, this is just a setup just to get the inputs, and then we have the operator array, so that's able to help us distinguish what operator is going to be placed or is going to be utilized in this function, and the return value is just the return value based on the operator. So that operator array is pretty important because I just said it in this function. I just said an if function to basically differentiate between the different basically assign the correct operation to occur based on the input from the user. So basically all this if statement is doing is like, hey, if the operator parameter is equal to 0 on the operator array, which is equivalent to the plus sign, then you do the addition, then you return the value of the addition function with the first input and the second input. So that's why I'm able to do 5 plus 5 equals 10, right? And then once that value is calculated, then all you have to do is display it you display it here. And then we set this display manipulate array back to empty because I kind of use I use an array to kind of manipulate basically turning like my input into text and back into numbers, just to basically kind of either display it as text or manipulate it as numbers within the array. And then we just set the first input back to an empty string so that more numbers can be entered after an operator after an operation has concluded. So moving further down the file, now I have assigned a whole bunch of variables to the certain DOM elements within my function, or certain elements within the calculator. Basically, all I'm doing is giving JavaScript a reference point to reference all the different buttons that I have on the calculator. So like if you could see here, this delete button, I'm just telling based on because I gave this query selector, I gave this delete button an ID of delete, and you can see it right here, that delete button right there. I gave it basically assigning this variable that element of the delete button, right? And I did the same thing for all the different buttons here, because as you get later down here, I had to add event listeners so that I could actually have some functionality with these buttons. And what I mean by functionality with these buttons is essentially meaning when I click these buttons, it does something. And that's what essentially add event listeners do. So as mentioned before, the 0 is associated with this 0 button, this 0 HTML document. And then what I'm doing is adding an event listener. And what an event listener does is adding an event for a for the element to like listen for on that specific element, so for that 0. And then once that event is happening, I enter in a function that I want to happen once that event has happened. So if I click 0, once I click 0, all this is happening. And essentially all I'm doing is breaking down 0, whatever's entered in on the 0, and entering it and having it display out here on this display text. And that's essentially the same thing I did for all the other numbers. So that's a kind of like a wrap on like with the event listeners for the numbers. And then what I think is also interesting is well, I'm gonna get into what happens when you actually click the operand or the operator button. All right, so what I mean by operator button, obviously I'm talking about the the addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division numbers or division buttons over here. And essentially these providing these operators with these buttons with add event listeners, so things can happen once these buttons are pressed. So I have the add event listener method and add click, which is right. So when I press click or I press the plus button, then all this happens. And this kind of ties in to why I had that operation counter. It really is essentially just to help me understand if I can chain what happens when I can chain certain operators. So right, have an if function that essentially 5 plus 5, but if I don't want to press the equal sign immediately and I just want to continue with another operation, I can do minus, right? And it already completed that 5 plus 5 for me, and it gave me the 10. So now I know I'm operating with 10, and I already have minus. So then I just do 10 again, and then I can put equals, and that equals 0, because 5 plus 5 minus 10 equals 0. So yeah, essentially that's what the plus button does in a nutshell. It just gives me the capability to actually add the or basically give the logic to add all the different inputs that I have previous to me or after I enter in the inputs. So that's kind of what this, and it's the same thing for the rest of the other functions. So it's the same methodology, but just using the different symbols for that respective operator. So everything here is going to be like, have the plus, and then everything for the minus is going to have the subtraction symbol, and et cetera, for multiplication and division. And then, just to give a little bit of background on like clear, because I think that's also the clear and delete buttons. These are just like, this is the logic utilized to kind of, delete input like display here. So if I were to press like 555, I'm able to press this delete button and delete out the 5 to not be utilized in the by 1 in the display text. And then 60 kind of just, in the clear button just clears out everything. And then the add event listener here for click, essentially all it does is like all it does is when I have 5 plus 5 equals, or when I equals, it does that, and I click it and it just kind of goes back to the operate function that I declared earlier. So that is essentially all of the JavaScript in a nutshell. Kind of walk you through my thinking process and what kind of the methods I utilize to make this calculator, make the logic. It's kind of bloated, and maybe it doesn't follow a lot of the, I don't follow a lot of the, I guess, the dry methodology, not repeating code, but, again, beginner. And this is a project I look forward to refactoring in later and coming back and making the code a little more condensed and easier to read. But, this is my calculator logic in a nutshell, and I appreciate you viewing this video, and, wish you guys a blessed rest of your day. Peace out.